is like a productivity tool for note taking, task management or like project tracking as well. And it's something that I personally use actually just to keep track of, different things that I'm working on as well. But there's kind of two steps to kind of creating or like calling like a Notion endpoint. So this is kind of like what a sample of kind of Notion looks like. But over here, we have like a reading list. And this is actually just built off of like Notion's kind of, web UI right now. But it has what they call like a database, which shows you the different, essentially it's just like similar to like a spreadsheet that just gives you like a different columns as well as different variables. And you can kind of just add through these as you want as well. But it gives you like a brief description. And this is just within like the Notion UI. So to pull for this, there's actually two different steps that I kind of want to walk through. There's first this search step. And you can see what the search step does is it actually runs a post request to the Notion API. And over here, you'll see like it requires an authorization, like a bearer token. It's a JSON package or payload that it's sending, as well as you're passing through this Notion version. And this is an example of like the payload that's passing through. Essentially, it's just sorting through the different database. And these are what Notion considers databases. And it's just sorting these in an ascending order by the last edited time. So after this, the next step that we want to do is we want to kind of take that ID that we get in the response from this search, and we want to retrieve that database information or information on that database. So I found this endpoint that they actually have called retrieve a database, and this runs a GET request to this version 1 database endpoint. And it just, same thing, it just kind of runs that through. You give an authorization, you pass through the database ID over here, and then it'll give you information on the specific database that we're pulling through. So let me just run through, I'll just change my demo environment. So we'll run through an example of kind of how that works, passing through one thing or result from the search function, and then passing that through into another function or another call, which pulls in that database information. So same thing over here, we'll just call this, we'll click on Create River and click on Action River. But now instead of choosing this REST action, we're going to use this multi-action just because there's two steps involved, a search function, as well as, the calling or retrieving a database information. So first we'll give this a name. So we'll call this Notion API multi-action. And you'll see this multi-action is actually built off these blocks called action steps. So we'll create a new action here, and you'll see this UI is very similar to kind of what you saw in that REST action step. So we'll call this Notion step 1 or action step 1. And same thing, we'll build out that initial like API call. So we're using that search function here again. And this time we're using a post request instead of like a GET request. No auth, but we are using two different headers for that authorization. So we'll just add those in. So the first one is just going to be an authorization key. And the next one's going to be that, I believe it's called like the Notion version. So for the Notion version, we're actually going to use their one from last year. And then over here, we're going to actually parameterize that bearer token. So you actually don't need to just put in the specific token as a variable, or like the value doesn't have to be an entire variable. You can even add like text. So like we're going to add bearer before here. And same thing with the Notion API. I've already kind of pre-created this, but that variable is going to pop up here, which I call connection.bearer. So we'll pull in connection.bearer over here. And then now we kind of need to add in that request body. So that request body, we're essentially just going to pull from the Notion documentation. Same thing, we're filtering on databases specifically. We're pulling the object information, and we're sorting this by ascending, just by last edited time. There's a few advanced options here as well that are available, and we're not going to use any of these, but just wanted to show you that these are available. You have a sleep after request as well as timeout after request as well. Well, we are going to configure the results to kind of, work for us. So we'll test the REST action first, just to make sure this is working. And over here, you'll see a sample of the action results that we're getting. So what we actually want to go to is we actually want to pull this specific ID over here for this database object that we're getting. So as you can see, this is in the results section and is the first one that's coming through. And that's going to be for our reading list database. So to pull this, we'll actually select the results, change this from results as the entire response into variables. So the reason that we're using variables is that we want to pass this result or this ID into a next step, which then calls more information on that. So over here, we just put $results, and we'll put 0 since we're looking for the first index. And then we'll add those variables to return. And over here, we're just going to call this something like ID underscore value. And we're actually just looking for the ID field. So after this is done, we can just see a sample of kind of what that looks like, or just hit save. And then over here, you'll see that, we're first getting some input information where we're passing through those connection bearer token, but we are also now getting an output field called ID underscore value. So the next step is to kind of add this into our next step that we've created, which is going to be requesting or retrieving that database. So we'll just call this Notion action step 2. Same thing, we'll use our connection called the Notion API. And then over here, we'll type in the URL. So this URL is just from this retrieve database URL. Over here, you'll see it's http.com version 1 database, and this database ID. So for that URL, we'll just type in that notion.com version 1 database. But now the next step is we want to parameterize kind of the database variable that we're passing through. To do that, we just create a new variable, call that database ID, and click add variable. Now we can just copy that variable and just paste it into the URL. And now we're kind of parameterizing this to be like a dynamic database ID that we pass through. Same thing as the other one. We just want to add in a few headers. And this is going to be the authorization. Same thing, this is going to be the bearer. This is going to be Notion-version. And then we're just going to give this a date. And we'll pull in that connection.bearer token here again as well. And then same thing on the result side now. We're going to want to store the data as it comes through and parse this out since we eventually want to get this into our target data warehouse. So we'll just save this through. And you'll see over here that now we have an input variable of database ID. So now that we have this input variable that we created, we just have to copy this from over here in the variables. And now this is saying action step 1, reference ID value. So this output over here is being passed through in the secondary step over here. So over here, you'll see this entire flow is just, we're running that first search request, outputting an ID value, and then taking that ID value and then writing that into the URL to select the specific database that we want to pull from. So we can actually run a test multi-action, and it'll run through both of these steps. So over here, you'll see the first step that's completed. And on the top left, you can even, see a little pop-up of the specific value that was passed through. We'll see this is the database ID that was passed through. And this kind of just matches up with that database ID that we have over here. And then in the second step, we'll see that that ID has now been passed through. And now we're pulling all this information as well. And we're getting a 200 response code. So now we can just save this. And this is just like a multi-step kind of river that we've created that using 2 API calls that are different and passing variables from one to another. So similarly to kind of like the currency one that we had earlier, we'll just hit create river again. Wait, let me just make sure I save this. Create river again, select source of target, call this Notion to Snowflake. Scroll down, select our REST API source, select that Notion API multi-action that we created. Same thing, we select a Snowflake instance that we're writing to. We'll just give it a database name, solutions, CC test, and we'll call this Notion underscore database. And on the schema side, same thing, we'll just run the auto mapping. And this auto mapping is actually running both those steps as well. So really searching the database and then writing the first database into a specific table. So over here, you'll see all the different parameters that are coming through. And you, again, if you wanted to, you could schedule this to run at whatever frequency you want. And we can hit save. And then we can just run this river as well. So we can actually run this and it'll go through the same process. It'll show you the 2 different stages as they're going through. Writing first initially to a file zone, and then writing from that file zone into your data warehouse. So just one quick thing, you can actually configure your file zone as well to write to a custom file zone. So there's 2 steps, kind of it writes it from pulls the API, writes it into like a file zone, and takes it from the file zone and then writes it to your data warehouse. We actually give you the option to use a custom file zone. So if you want to kind of host your data within your own like cloud instance, you can host it within your own S3 or your blob So kind of none of the data ever touches like kind of Rivery's instance. In this case, we're just using like the default one, which gets cleared after like 48 hours as well. So you'll see over here, it's completed the first step and is now loaded into Snowflake. So we'll just kind of query that Notion database over here. I've already built out the query. And you'll see over here that it selects that database object. It even gives you like the emoji for kind of like the cover that it's using. And this is just pulling that reading list information over here.